Okay, so dear colleagues, before we start, I would like to inform those present that the lecture is being recorded, as you can hear, and the recording will be made public. If you say anything during its course, you agree with the publication of your statement in this recording. The discussion after the lecture will be not recorded and not made public. And now the presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest lecturer, Florencia Ferrante, who will be sharing her expertise on translation history of religion translation in Atlantic world. Florencia is an assistant professor at the University of Genoa. She studied literature at the University of Buenos Aires and Italian studies at the University of Bologna. In 2018, she earned her PhD in comparative literature. She's been a postdoctoral researcher in a national research project concerning the history of non-literary translation from Italian to Spanish in Latin America. And she's the author of a book, Juan Rodolfo Wilcock Critico, and she published articles in translation history and literary criticism in international journals such as World Literature Studies, Meta, Reseña Iberística, Hispamérica, etc. And now she will share her insights in a talk titled Metaphors We Think and Research by Entangled Threads of Religious Translation in the 18th Century Atlantic World. Florencia, la palabra es tuya.
Well, before I begin, I want to thank again to express my gratitude to my colleagues, to all of you at the Institute of World Literature and of the Slovak Academy of Sciences for inviting me, for having me here, and well, giving me the opportunity to share my research with you. And well, especially I want to thank the director, Robert Gavrik, for the formal invitation to be here, and Katarina Bednarova and Maria Kusa for your project, which I feel already a part of, given that I've been working with Igor on that line of research, and I learned a lot. So thank you again. And well, of course, well, thank you, Natalia, for presenting me and for having me in your home. I know that it's not easy with a little baby, but well, we are doing great. And Igor, thank you very much for entrusting me from the beginning with this collaboration. And well, I hope that everything turned out to be fine. I think I do. I'm convinced that it went very well. So I'm be brief. I won't bore you. I will just start with this lecture called Metaphors We Think and Research by Entangled Threads of Religious Translation in 18th Century Atlantic Work. I don't think I will be able to get to Latin America. That was my first idea, but I will get close to it. I will be talking about the Spanish Empire and its territories in the Latin American region. So we will discuss it later if there are questions about that particular geography. Well, in his seminal paper, Conjectures on World Literature, Franco Moretti describes, among other things, the two basic cognitive metaphors that historians, cultural historians in this case, have used to analyze culture on a world scale, on a large scale anyway. That's the tree and the wave, as we know. The tree metaphor, according to him, postulates branches of phenomena deriving from a common core, from the same trunk, and it moves from unity to diversity. The wave metaphor, on the other hand, observes a uniformity engulfing an initial diversity and mimics the mechanisms of the market. Moretti's conclusion, at least in this article published in the New Left Review many years ago, is that while both metaphors are effective conceptual devices with significant explanatory power over a set of phenomena, they do not work equally well. Moretti also notes, with a remark maybe less obvious than it sounds, that, quote, the universe is the same, the literatures are the same, we just look at them from a different point of view, viewpoint. We are convinced that our viewpoint is better because it has greater explanatory power or because it appears to be conceptually more elegant. Be that as it may, we recognize that these working metaphors do not just merely reflect or represent our thoughts, but that they essentially structure our experience and, as Moretti suggests, also the way in which conceptualize our data in order to answer our research questions and to solve our research problems. Well, we know that this is the author that introduced one of the probably most influential spatial metaphors ever used in comparative literature research since then, which is the distant reading concept. As this is in the nature of the best and more powerful conceptual metaphor, distant reading was interpreted and applied in a myriad different ways. And this is precisely its beauty. Researchers in the social sciences and the humanities constantly deploy cognitive metaphors because they offer significant explanatory power while remaining susceptible to nuance, modification, and reinterpretation. In what follows, I will first briefly comment on how translation historians have adapted some conceptual metaphors, mainly borrowed from historiography itself, concepts and metaphors such as the micro-micro approach and entanglement. Secondly, building on these reflections, I will apply my conclusions to present a cluster of translations that offer, I think, an unsettling perspective of one of the dominant narratives in Italian literary historiography, that is the fortune or the fortuna paradigm, or fortune or influence paradigm in studying in literature or the history of literature. How do I? This one?
Oh.
Okay. At the micro historical approach, at least in its original Italian formulation, which is perhaps the best known and the one that has been most widely used by translation historians, has at least three main characteristics, among others, of course. I'm choosing these characteristics for my argument. As we know, microhistory is an historiographical approach that calls for, quote, intensive historical investigation of a relatively well-defined smaller object, most often a single event or a village community, a family or a person, unquote. Its most distinct feature is then the thorough and detailed analysis of a well-defined historical subject, in contrast to the serial or quantitative social scientific history that focuses on great structures and the long term. A second important feature of Italian microhistory is that the purpose of the reduction of the scale of observation is, in any case, to answer, quote unquote, great historical questions and to reach general conclusions about deep historical, social, and cultural structures, which are deemed to be more accessible, more observable on this micro level of observation. Moreover, true to the leftist thinking and Marxist backgrounds of its original practitioners and theorists, these small social groups observed were frequently, quote, marginal or marginalized peoples who would be left out of historical accounts by other methods, unquote. There is, however, a third characteristic in the microhistorical original lens that is perhaps one of its most crucial features, as I understand it, and the one most frequently bypassed or minimized in the subsequent reinterpretations and manipulations of the micro-metaphor. This is the implementation of the so-called evidential paradigm, by which the historian should enter the cultures of the past by observing not the typical or the mainstream, but the quote-unquote exceptional normal. It is something that does not fit, a strange or unsettling detail, a marginal group or behavior that stands out in the eyes of the observer or in previous accounts or in the archival sources and the documentation at the historian's disposal. From this perspective, then, microhistories are not made of an aggregation of typical case studies from which one can derive general norms. One cannot say then that a collection of different micro case studies helps to draw conclusions on a macrostructural level. On the contrary, it is the normal exceptionality of the subject of study and not its representativity that can reveal a hidden reality, a structure behind the discontinuity of the data itself. The historian, however, must be willing to follow the clues offered by the documentation and the sources as Ariadne's thread, and like a detective, reassemble and regroup the traces found during the research path in order to offer a different account, a zoom in, a close up, Ginsburg says, of a previously discarded or unknown subject. The reliance on the evidential paradigm entails, hence, at the same time, and I will quote the second slide, I will quote, the definite awareness that all phases through which research unfolds are constructed and not given. The identification of the object at its importance, the elaboration of the categories through which it is analyzed, the criteria of proof, the stylistic and narrative forms by which the results are transmitted to the reader. This is Ginsburg in 1993. So the micro-metaphor also implies that the research process itself becomes a subject of the historian's reflexivity, and therefore of her or his narrative. The way in which we come across an exceptional document or an exciting case study, the lacuna on the documentation and the frequently fortuitous navigation of the archives, which is a subject of another Ginsburg's paper, Conversare con Orion. Indefinite, the sometimes accidental or casual interpretive path that leads us eventually to our conclusions. We may ask at this point, which of these meanings of the micro approach have been actually put to use by translation historians? As micro-historians themselves admit, the concept of micro has been widely and constantly revisited, and it acquired different meanings for its different practitioners, a perfectly legitimate use of an intrinsically metaphorical concept, which finds its exact confines in the actual research practice. Crucially, while not many studies in translation history have openly applied a micro-historical approach, theoretical and methodological discussions within the field have repeatedly considered microhistory as a useful historiographical paradigm. Most notably, Jeremy Munday associated the microhistorical approach to the deployment of primary sources for historical research, such as translator papers, interviews, archives. Interestingly, in his 2014 paper on the possibilities of microhistory of translation, Munday still felt the need to anticipate the objections that a major representative of descriptive translation studies, such as Thury, whom he quotes, Thury, could or would raise against relying on, quote unquote, semi-theoretical critical formulations brought by archival research. Such a reliance would in fact prevent the researcher from achieving a scientific objective analysis of the translation product itself in terms, for example, of norms of patterns and behaviors. Needless to say, it is precisely again against the scientific and experimental quantitative paradigm in social and cultural history to what microhistorians were reacting. So Munday concludes that the choice of the paradigm, quote, depends on the history we want to tell. Jeremy Munday's views on microhistory inclines then towards the study of individual translators and their papers and testimonies, something that translation historians have certainly done. A few years earlier, Sergia Adamo made another theoretical case from a microhistorical approach in translation history, not without acknowledging that translation historians had already concerned themselves with some of the purposes of microhistory, namely to rediscover previously neglected subjects and the desire to highlight the disrupting role of translation in cultural history, positing it exactly as the exceptional case that goes against some consolidated narratives. Adamo stressed this, however, one particular feature of the micro approach that had not been sufficiently considered, says she, by translation historians, and that is, quote unquote, that the method for the evaluation of historical evidence that is the evidential paradigm, the method of the evaluation of your historical evidence through what Carlo Ginzburg has called the conjectural or evidential paradigm, what we were discussing before. This entails, in Adamo's reading, the awareness that the historian, and this is a very interesting point, I think, that the historian dialogues not with the past itself, but with strands and remains of it, that these remains, clues and traces of the past, are questioned and followed by the researcher from a particular position, and that the documentary fragments of the past influence the historian just as much as the questions and the intuition of the historian influence the evidence and the resulting account. From this dialogic engagement with what's left of the past, or what is cognoscible of it, because Adamo said the past is utterly alien and it remains undeniably other, says she, one may well conclude that it would be extremely difficult and perhaps not even desirable to build grand, systematic and fluid overarching narratives to account for a historically minor, minoritized and sometimes subversive practice such as translation. Sergio Adamo then concludes, are there any grounds, quote, are there any grounds for writing this history if the constitutive hybridity of interculturality of translation may lose its disruptive potential when involved in the tricks of master narratives and master objects of study? Well, this is Sergio Adamo. This is your point. Well, I would like to conclude this brief and schematic discussion of the interpretations of the micro, in translation history research by recalling one last very strong cognitive metaphor put forward, this time by a translation historian. I'm referring to Martha Cheng's so-called pushing hands approach, which is not far removed from the interpretive path we have been following thus far. This very original and articulated approach to translation history, conceived as the intellectual application of a specific martial art, basically posits the need of the researcher's sustained self-questioning and dialogic engagement between allegedly dichotomic positions in the conviction that all knowledge, and especially so historical knowledge, is mediated, and that the best way to respond to a great incoming narrative, the force of a master narrative, is not by opposing force by force, it has to come up with another full-fledged historical master narrative, but by shifting the balance, by being aware of the other's position, when there's always, one might say, a truth that can function as a lever, and redirecting the force into something new. Cheng calls for a multi-perspective, multilinguistic, dialogic, and multiscalar historical narrative, which she implements in her monumental anthology of Chinese discourse on translation. Maybe not surprisingly, Cheng concludes her reasoning by positing that there are similarities, quote, between the pushing hands approach, and the approaches and the models propounded by colleagues engaged in histoire croisée, entangled history, and microhistory. And then she goes on to mention Carlo Ginzburg, the exceptional normal rule, and the histoire croisée toolbox, which we will translate entangled history toolbox, as it's theorized by Werner and Zimmermann. Unfortunately, Cheng didn't elaborate any further on these similarities, but she left the door open for other historians to do so, and others did, such as Judy Wakabayashi wrote a paper about this remark and developed it. If there is then, and I'm concluding this first theoretical part, something that in common between the micro, the pushing hands, and the entangled conceptual metaphors as interpreted in translation history by translation historians, I would say that it is first and foremost the reflexive nature of these approaches. The awareness, to cite Ginzburg again, that all the phases of research are construed and not given, and that we need to account for them. The fact that it is the researcher who posits the entanglements to be observed and utilizes the intercrossing of historical perspectives, viewpoints, methodologies, and scales in order not to unearth a hidden reality, but in order to establish new meanings, to create new perspectives, and to study specific meaning effects. That's what they say. The stress laid by historiography on a multiplicity of possible viewpoints and divergences, I'm citing, quoting, categorizations and conceptualizations adds another dimension to the inquiry. Postulating meaningful entanglements is not, evidently, a straightforward task, for it tends to be a compromise between what the object bears into the equation and what the researchers can abduct by her or his own experience, knowledge, habits, etc. So, I will deal in the following with one of the most important intellectuals of Italian 18th century, that's Lodovico Antonio Muratori. Well, Muratori stands perhaps as one of the most eminent Italian authors of the 18th century, not only because of the impact of his thought across the various states of the Italian peninsula, but also from the extensive dissemination of his work beyond Italian borders, including the Hispanic American territories. He was an erudite polymath. His intellectual productions span the breadth of contemporary knowledge from theology, historiography, philosophy, paleography, poetics, you name it. He contributed to the modernization of historical studies. He discovered and systematized documents of exceptional importance and significance for ecclesiastical history and the Middle Ages. Furthermore, he was a moderate but audacious reformer, operating within the constraints of the Catholic hierarchy, of course. Well, in the case of Muratori, the strength, the force of the incoming force, as Martha Chen would say, the master historical narrative is enormous, as it is sustained by an immense bibliography going back for centuries, and by very well-established disciplinary and academic traditions, such as Italian religious historiography. I will dialogue with this tradition on two main assumptions, and I will postulate an entanglement. I will dialogue with received ideas, first of all, about the critical fortune of Muratori's thought outside the Italian confines, especially in the Spanish Empire. And then I will deal with received ideas about translation and its practice in the critical studies, literature, and bibliography on Muratori. In order to do this, I will postulate an entanglement that I must admit, with a little surprise maybe, hasn't been thoroughly considered before. And it's the fact that Muratori was himself a translator, and also a very audacious one, because he was the first, or at least not among the first, but among the first three, to translate the liturgy of the Mass, the text of the Mass, literally from Latin into Italian. This undertaking, we are in the 18th century, this undertaking was fraught with controversy, as we will see afterwards. And I will call this translation endeavor, this translation work, a translation gesture, an intervention, a performance almost, that is intimately linked to Muratori's linguistic, historiographical, and doctrinal thought, as well as to a cultural policy. Furthermore, the work containing that translation, the La Regolata Devozione dei Cristiani, was itself translated into many different languages, including Spanish, and remains one of the most widely disseminated works of Muratori across Europe. The close reading at the end of this lecture of that Spanish translation will help us observe the fortune of Muratori's work and his influence in the Spanish-speaking world from a slightly different angle, to observe from another perspective. And the presence of Muratori's works are outside the Italian borders. If you read the bibliography and the literature of Muratori, his presence was almost always approached from what we shall call the fortuna paradigm. This is a very Italian word to refer to the fortune of an author and his influence on other authors. Well, as we know, the author's fortuna is, in short, the influence or the presence, the impact of their work on other authors within or without their national linguistic tradition. There are several ways to trace historically an author's fortune, of course. Textual and stylistic models, topics, genres, interpersonal relationships, epistolary communications, rewritings, etc. And of course, translations. While tracing the impact of a relevant figure across other cultural and linguistic traditions, the paradigm of fortuna usually takes for granted that the influence is positive, measurable, and unidirectional. Translations have been and still remain a privileged object of these studies. For the paradigm of fortuna, there is no better and more reliable index of an author's reception than the translation of their work. In the case of the fortune of Muratori in the Spanish-speaking world, the corpus of his translations was actually quickly systematized and studied. This scholarship on Muratori's translation into Spanish tends to point out that, well, first of all, the great influence of his ideas everywhere. And the ideas of Muratori on the translator in question, who was, more often than not, a relevant intellectual figure, of course. Second, this bibliography of Muratori also acknowledges the fact that almost always the translations into Spanish of Muratori's texts are highly unfaithful. They depart from the original in a rather evident manner, as they frequently use Muratorian text and ideas to convey the translator's own ideas and demands linked to the historical political circumstances of the moment. So far, so good, then. This appears to be no more than a typical enlightened modality of knowledge transfer, the cultural appropriation of foreign ideas and their reevaluation and domestication vis-à-vis the local circumstances. Upon considering, however, other historical accounts of Muratori, his letters and his institutional communications with other European intellectuals, it became more evident that Muratori's Catholic reformism was actually deeply and fundamentally resisted and opposed by Spanish ecclesiastical and political hierarchies generally. The suspect grew then, as unfitting evidence, to quote Ginsburg, that the critically established fortune of Muratori's thought in the 18th century Spanish Empire by means of translation, sometimes on occasions, may have overshadowed its frequent censorship and sometimes plain rejection. I wanted to investigate then and examine, from the standpoint of translation history, the limits and the difficulties of Muratori's celebrated intellectual fortune in the Hispanic world. And it is at this point that I came to consider more closely one of the most famous and certainly one of the most translated and circulated works by Muratori ever, which is called Della regolata devozione dei cristiani, or Della regolata devozione dei cristiani. Well, it is in this book, as I anticipated, where Muratori includes his own first, or probably one of the first translations of the Liturgy of the Mass in Italian. The first thing that caught my attention in the bibliographic review on Muratori, the critical literature of Muratori, was the fact that Muratori has actually never been considered a translator, despite having actually published one of the first translations of the liturgy of the Mass ever in Italian. I am not claiming here that no historian had ever noticed or considered this translation before. No, I'm saying that no one had approached it from the standpoint of translation history, and I will try to explain why positing this entanglement, talking about entanglements and intercrossings, is relevant. To fully grasp the significance of this translation intervention, a few clarifications are in order. Della regolata devozione is the culmination of a religious reformist vision of this author that he cultivated his entire life. So this treatise exhibits a singular coexistence. On the one hand, there is a desire to intervene directly in the most heated debates of contemporary Catholic reformism. On the other, there is a didactic impulse rooted in a pastoral concern to elucidate and explain the tenets of the faith for a broad lay audience, one neither specialized in theology nor particularly learned. And how does he do that? He delineates the features of a regulated, rational, and well-ordered religiosity. One religiosity that is internalized, rational, participatory, etc. Furthermore, this treatise is written, be aware, in a popular Italian language variety, for it was addressed not only to the ecclesiastical hierarchies or the cultural elites, but to the popolo, to the people. He writes popolo that way, common people. So here we have an eminent Catholic intellectual writing in a popular variety of Italian, popular, and seeking to concern the people, common people, with a rational, interiorized, reflexive, and learned version of the Christian message. A regulated and aware religiosity that was, for him, a condition for a well-regulated and functioning society. We must remind here, and a brief reminder, that the literal translation of the words of the Mass in the vernacular languages was not allowed. The Catholic celebration of the Mass was to be in Latin, and the direct literal translation of liturgy was opposed and rejected by Catholic discipline. Muratori knew well that the inclusion of the literal translation of the whole Mass was a risky decision, and he openly shared his concerns about the convenience of publishing this translation with friends and bishops and cardinals currently serving in the papal court. He was repeatedly warned of the risks and complications, and the Pope himself denied his approval to the enterprise. He didn't say anything, but by means of silence, he didn't oppose it, but he didn't accept it either. So why did Muratori, an organic Catholic intellectual, translate it and publish this translation anyway? What is behind this translation intervention, this translation gesture that has... Let's hear from Muratori himself. Okay. We might. Okay. So to introduce, he introduces his translation with the following words. He says something like this. This is my translation. He says, moreover, says Muratori, it is a certain thing that the devout people assisting at the Mass also make the sacrifice, united with the sacred minister. And this is gathered from the very words of the Holy Mass, as will be shown moving forward, says Muratori, in an Italian popular language. The rite of the ancient church has, by necessity, undergone some changes over time. As the Mass was celebrated in ancient centuries in the Latin language, which was regularly understood by the people subject to the Roman Empire in the West, the Christian people still understood the beautiful prayers of the Mass and responded to the priest. With time, little by little, the Latin language began to corrupt with the birth of the Italian, French, and Spanish vernaculars, such as only the learned, and these were still very few among the laity, understood Latin speech, and it finally became foreign and not understood by common people. Says Muratori, for many, the ignorance of the Latin language is a great obstacle to the birth and maintenance of the necessary devotion in their hearts. Then, for the glory of God and the benefit of the ignorant, I wish here to explain the Mass itself and its most holy, admirable prayers to those who do not understand its language, nor understand what the priest is asking of God in the name of those present during the celebration. And if anyone who understands Latin can read it and savor its holy meanings, it seems only right that such understanding should not be begrudged to those of lesser intellect, since it can redound to the increase of their devotion, nor is the majesty of the great function diminished in the slightest by it. If we transcribe Muratori's justification of his translation gesture at length, it is because it is here where you can clearly observe the entanglements at work behind this translation performance and the different dimensions that inevitably converge in the necessity of translating the liturgy for the first time. First of all, it is a matter of doctrine, because this is a point of doctrine that Muratori repeatedly makes in different works and treatises. If one accepts that the faithful make the sacrifice along with the priest, and this is a doctrinal point, then they are not just passive spectators, but they have to participate. So they have to understand the words and the rites they are involved in, says Muratori. Second of all, there is a pastoral concern. This is a central tenet of his reformist vision. As Muratori maintains in other parts of the treatise, the cause of the lack of reverence and popular respect for the sacred is due in part to the distance perceived from the ritual, the opacity of the ritual, the unintelligibility of it. For him, the interiorization of faith necessarily passes through rational comprehension and active participation. In the third place, we can observe also a linguistic and philological dimension, because in stating the thesis that the vernaculars derive from the corruption of the Latin language, which was not necessarily a mainstream assumption by then, Muratori maintains also that in the ancient church, everybody understood the language of the rite. So there is no reason why today things should be different. At the same time, Muratori seems to ascertain that there is no real eschatological hierarchy between Latin and the vernacular languages derived from it. Latin does not carry a message that is qualitatively or intrinsically superior to that of the vernaculars for Muratori. And for this reason, the text can be translated without causing damage to the message or to the solemnity of the occasion. As our interpretation suggests, Muratori's translation gesture then goes beyond mere doctrinal concerns. The debate over liturgical translation usually exposes and materializes the entanglements between religious doctrine, the necessity of understanding, linguistic and philological assumptions, the implementation of a cultural policy, the need for everyone to understand not only liturgy but everything, and the advancement of societal reform. Muratori's translation gesture is based on the conviction, as he states in this treatise and in other treatises, of the equal dignity of all languages. It is grounded in the use of a simple and popular Italian, comprehensible and immediate. It stresses that an intelligible liturgy and an active participation in the life of the church is a prerequisite for a regulated devotion, which is in turn a prerequisite for the harmonious functioning of the entire society. It makes accessible to the laity a body of knowledge and meanings that had hitherto been denied to them. So within Muratori's broader reformist program, the translation of the Mass, included in this treatise, carries the same weight, so it has the same value of any other reformist stance presented also in this treatise, such as his campaigns to reduce feast days and to eradicate superstition. It is part of a comprehensive response, the translation of liturgy, and in this case the Mass, to the social, political, and cultural problematics that he observed in the different territories of Italian 18th century. The entanglement between all these different dimensions is materially represented in the embedment of the translation in the textual architecture of the treatise. Because the 6 chapters dedicated to the Mass, to the translation of the Mass, constitute the core chapters of the book. They are preceded by the explanation of the cardinal virtues and sacraments, and they are followed by a discussion of the excesses in popular devotions, such as the superstition, the devotion of the worship of relics, for example, of the worship of the images of saints, and what all of this was considered to be a superstitious kind of devotion. So he opposed also this type of behavior. And furthermore, it is important to notice that the Italian words of the Mass are not an autonomous body. So there's not just the Mass in the translation of the Mass in the book, but they are surrounded by a dense critical and interpretive apparatus. Muratori then not only translates the Latin text, but also adds his comments, his explanations. So if you observe a page from this part of the treatise, you can see that the translation, the literal translation, is in italics. And then in Roman type, you have the comments and the explanations of the author. So this is how the original version looks like. Se può scegliere l'italiano angelico, cioè il, this is Muratori speaking, Gloria in excelsis, this is the title of the prayer, che in italiano suona così, that in Italian would be something like this. It sounds like this, sia glorificato, etc. So this is the core, the 5 chapters, the core chapters are something like this. As you can observe, the Italian version of the Mass appears in italics to distinguish it from the voice of the translator commentator. Well, at this point, another set of questions for a translation historian emerges. How did Muratori translate? What kind of translator was he? How did he approach this complicated issue of the translation of sacred texts, living close to Rome and in close contact to the Vatican hierarchies? What are his comments and annotations to the text? And more crucially, how have other historians, not historians, translation historians, general historians of religions, for instance, how have they addressed this linguistic dimension of this unprecedented translation? It was the first translation of the Mass. It is safe to say that, unfortunately, most historians have neglected this aspect almost entirely, with one notable exception. That is the historian of liturgy, Giuseppe Landotti. Why it is interesting to consider Giuseppe Landotti's ideas? Because his position of this historian, religious historian, tells us very much about how translation is conceptualized outside our disciplinary field of specialization, and shows also how an entangled perspective, the one that I'm trying to propose, in this case, a reflexive approach to the working concepts used by different disciplinary traditions, helps the historization and critical observation of received concepts. Because Landotti, in his historical study about Italian translations of the Mass, seems to introduce a distinction between traduzione fedele e letterale, or traduzione letterale e fedele, which is literal translation or a faithful rendering, and paraphrastic translation, traduzione parafrastica, or paraphrasy, paraphrastic translation. He works with these two concepts in his essay, in his book. He does not specify the exact linguistic operation involved. He doesn't say which one means what. He doesn't give any examples, but he does assign a precise function to each of these modes of translating within the liturgical sphere. According to Landotti, then, literal translation of the meaning, word by word, was intended fundamentally to allow the participant in the Mass to follow the celebration. So you are there with your book and the words of the Mass, and you can understand what the priest is saying. This means that the translation works as a vernacular aid, a textual guide. Paraphrastic translation, on the other hand, which is often longer and more voluminous, aimed instead with his liturgical erudition rather than practical use. A paraphrase conveys a vicarious meaning, of course, and for this reason, a paraphrastic translation can serve also as a method for evading censorship. Be that as it may, what is quite surprising is that Landotti classifies Muratori's translation of the Mass included in the Regolata Devozione as a paraphrastic translation. And this is striking because upon even a brief examination of a few paragraph sentences, one can easily verify that Muratori's version is substantially literal, word by word for word, an almost exact rendition. Why then one of the scholars most attentive to the materiality of this translation classify it as a paraphrastic? Well, the answer, and that's the answer of other historians too, is that, and I use a distinction borrowed from Scopus theory, because he understood this translation not as an instrumental translation. I mean, not as a translation that you would use during the Mass to follow the words of the priest. It was not for him an instrumental translation whose function was to achieve the same functions as an original text. But it's a documentary translation for him, because the purpose of the translation was not a communicative interaction, but simply erudite liturgical erudition. So it was just to know about what happened during the Mass. Therefore, according to Landotti, the translated text is not autonomous, but it is contained within and surrounded by interpretative and critical apparatus, which guides the interpretation. The distinction is by no means minor, because in this period, the perception of a filter, of an explanatory commentary between the raw translated text and the audience, could be the determining factor in the approval or condemnation of a religious work. This was essentially because ecclesiastical censorship sought to avoid precisely the free interpretation of liturgical texts, as well as a direct relationship between the layman and the sacred word. Other religion historians, like Brandolini, for example, they hypothesize that the mere presence of a critical apparatus, an exegetical apparatus surrounding the literal words of the Mass, was to prevent shielded, that this dynamic shielded or protected Muratori from the accusation of Jansenism, because they were Jansenists who called precisely for a vernacular liturgy, etc. So the choice to call this translation paraphrastic, even though it is a commented translation, but it is actually absolutely a literal translation, is related to this problem, that he could be considered, he could be condemned, he could be considered an heretic, a Jansenist, if he had not obviously provide the reader with a series of notes, annotation, and exegetical apparatus to prevent that they would read the words of the liturgy as they wanted. Excuse me. Okay. Finish. Well, this is a legitimate explanation, of course, for this kind of embedded erudite paraphrastic translation. It could be a matter of censorship, of course. It could have shielded or protected Muratori from accusations. However, I think also that Muratori's comments and explanations of the text of the Latin Mass carried essential information that is integral to the translation gesture that I was outlining before. And this is because many of Muratori's comments and annotations are like not explanations per se, but are exegetical, are articulated historical and liturgical digressions in which the translator, he's talking to common people. So it is really an unprecedented thing. An complex in which the translator considers closely the words of the Mass. So, and then he sets forth his position regarding a series of doctrinal points, interpreting these words of the Mass. It is frequent, for example, that a specific formulation of the liturgical text, let's say, I don't know, the word oremus. So he dwells on a single word, on a specific formulation of the liturgical text, and it prompts a reflection of the author upon ancient customs, for example, or causes that he evoke in the practice of early church, thanks, of course, to his knowledge of liturgical history, because he was a historian, a liturgical historian. We must remember now that a close acquaintance with the sacred text was, for this reformist milieu, a key to the correct interpretation of the Christian message in this period, and gave access also to a full understanding of the tenets of the primitive church. So Muratori combines in his translation, meant for a popular public, he combines then what I call a close reading of the exact words of the rite, words that are for him a testimony of ancient tradition. They are carriers of the ancient tradition, and hence also a privileged access to the words, to the message of the Christian early church. So, well, he combines then this close reading with the exact words with a vast display of historical erudition at the service of understanding present-day religious practice and discipline. He explains these things to a broad audience. Also, at the service of a pastoral effort we have referred before. For this reason, I believe Muratori dares, or better, must translate literally, because the only means for him to historical understanding of the rites of the true message of Christian church is a close acquaintance with the textual sources, and not only for the literate or the intellectual elites, but for every Catholic. So he needs to translate literally. I'm coming to the end. Okay. And I will, well, in these few minutes that I have left, I will conclude briefly by the last issue that I plan to address, and that is the dialogue within Muratori's Fortuna in the Hispanic world and the translation of La Regolata Devozione. The Spanish translation of this treatise that I just referred to, La Devoción Arreglada del Cristiano, this is the Spanish translation, was published in 1763 by the royal printer Joaquín Ibarra and translated by a priest working also as a book censor for the crown, Miguel Pérez Pastor. So he was an organic intellectual of the crown. He was a censor, and it is really hard to imagine why a book censor like Miguel Pastor, who can be considered a bureaucrat of the Spanish crown, chose to focus his only translation effort on this particular work by Muratori. In the context of 18th century Spanish spirituality, Muratori was undoubtedly an awkward figure, an anomalous figure, and his religious reformism had been repeatedly opposed and rejected by Spanish ecclesiastical hierarchies. In any case, the translation of Pérez Pastor, this translation, but this is of Pérez Pastor, which is also the first translation of ever published of a Muratorian text, is a very good example of how resisted Muratorian religious reformism was still in 18th century Spain. So to be brief, how does Pérez Pastor retranslate the Muratorian translation gesture that we have been referring to? Well, he does not. He doesn't translate it. Even though Pérez Pastor declares in his prologue that his translation follows the original Muratorian treatise in every single part, he actually excludes several parts of the treatise, but this is a common practice, of course, in 18th century Spain. He excluded the parts not consistent with Spanish spirituality, and he completely rewrites. He doesn't omit, he rewrites the chapters devoted to the vernacular translation of the Mass. So he does not remove it completely, but he strips away all of Muratori's italics. What was in italics in Muratori's text is just stripped away. So he omits precisely the literal translation of the Mass, which should have been, of course, in this case, in Spanish. and replaces them with explanatory paraphrases. More often than not, that paraphrases serve as two purposes. They summarize the liturgical text without translating it literally, and simultaneously they condense Muratori's comments about it. It's just a very real paraphrastic translation. So the Spanish translator does try to capture, despite the heavy editing, of course, tries to capture the meaning of the liturgy to a certain extent and Muratori's views. The interesting point, should be Muratori's view that the rite should be comprehensible in order to allow the faithful to unaware participation. So he shares the concern of Muratori of the need of the intelligibility of the rite. The interesting point here, that it at the same time to corroborate the anomaly and the disruptive nature of Muratorian gesture, is that Pérez Pastor found it, and he explains, inconceivable to give Spanish readers an access to the exact literal formulation of the ancient liturgical text in their own languages. For Muratori, on the contrary, this original text, as we extensively explained, are the master key to his intervention, the core of his translation gesture. Furthermore, Pérez Pastor denies completely unlearned readers access to certain knowledge that he felt was unnecessary or dangerous for them to possess without mediation. In this sense, Pérez Pastor, like 20 years after Muratori's death, is moving in the exact opposite direction of Muratori. While Muratori explicitly states that he wrote this treatise not for scholars but for common people, Pérez Pastor admits in his prologue that he carefully filtered the text, keeping only what is instructive and cutting out everything that could be meant for a learned, leaving out what is meant only for a learned audience and not for the people. In conclusion, by refusing to translate the actual words of the Mass, Pérez Pastor fundamentally dismantles what we call Muratori's translation gesture, the core of which wasn't just the content of the liturgical action, but the medium, the very use of a vernacular and popular Italian, popular vernacular language, to transmit the original Latin words, the very form of the message. The medium for Muratori was the message, a detail deliberately lost on his translation, who delivers a content, of course, because everything is understood, Muratori's contents are explained, and the meaning of the liturgy is explained, but loses, as we see it, the performative value of Muratori's gesture, which is what other translations in other languages kept closely and tried to keep on purpose. This gesture consisted, to summarize and conclude, of two radical moves which were absent for Pérez Pastor retranslation: the use of the vernacular to communicate religious matters, previously reserved for the learned, and the close reading of the sacred text, which treated the liturgy as a historical artifact, a lens through which to explain the past, but also to make sense of present-day practice. And through the understanding and the studying of liturgy, these meanings should be, according to Muratori, available to everyone willing to understand, because the exact words of the ancient church were a key for Muratori for understanding the primitive Christian pure message. So that's why he wanted to expose also a broader lay audience to this dynamic. So, in conclusion della regolata devozione, this was the conclusion. Della regolata devozione is perhaps, I'm concluding now, the peak of Muratori's intellectual career. At the height of his international fame and supported by a progressive pope, was Benedict XIV, Muratori condensed in this treatise the results of a lifetime of study and pastoral service. He was also a parish priest. He condensed all his experience in a treatise intended for, as I said before, a broad non-scholarly audience. This spiritual testament is also a program of religious reform that centers on the legitimation of the vernacular languages as tools for accessing knowledge relating to doctrine and religious practice. For this reason, we characterized Muratori's Italian translation of the Mass as a gesture, which is another metaphor, of course, if you please. What matters, and I repeat, I conclude, is not merely the content, but the intervention itself, the concrete use of Italian to transmit the exact words of the Latin Rite, a practice customarily censored by the Church. Essential to our demonstration is the performative value of the Muratorian operation, behind which lies a series of doctrinal, philological, linguistic, political, cultural, and social problematics and demands. While Habsburg reformism promptly appropriated Muratori's plan, because the La Regolata Devozione was translated in German and read by monarchs themselves and emperors, etc., within the Spanish Empire, his religious reformism was fiercely contested. Although a number of his books were translated, it is fair to say that his most controversial works remain untranslated in Spanish, and when translated, as in this case, they were profoundly manipulated, abridged, or censored. The Spanish translation of the La Regolata serves as evidence of this, we think. The complete omission of Muratori's translation gesture illustrates the limits and distortions of the perhaps over-celebrated fortune and influence in the Hispanic world. A legacy, the Muratorian legacy in the Spanish Empire, about which we still really know far too little, especially when it comes to the Spanish territories overseas, which I cannot obviously refer to right now. Okay, thank you very much.